On the night of April 22nd, 2026, 4 planets will align in the sky. An ancient meteor shower will fall for the 2700th year in a row, and some scientists are beginning to wonder if the magnetic field protecting all life on Earth, the only invisible shield standing between us and destruction, is actually being bent. Try to imagine. Do not imagine with effort. Do not try to paint a clear scene in your head. Simply let this thought come gently, like smoke dissolving into the air. You are lying down in a quiet place. Maybe a field at night, the kind of field where the grass is still wet with dew, and the smell of damp earth rises very lightly, enough for you to notice without thinking. Maybe a rooftop, higher than the street lamps, high enough for the city below to become a vague glow rather than noise. Or maybe, and this is completely enough, you are just lying in your bed right now, in the darkness of the room, with the night sky existing somewhere above the ceilings, the floors, the layers of clouds. It is still there. The sky is always there, whether you see it or not. Tonight is the night of April 22nd, and in the western sky, just above the horizon, in that space where the sunset has just left and the darkness has just entered, there are 4 points of light. They do not twinkle. That is the first thing you will realize if you know where to look. Real stars twinkle. Their light must pass through hundreds of kilometers of atmosphere and is refracted, vibrated by each layer of air with different temperatures and densities, creating that sparkling effect we often call twinkling stars. But the planets are different. They are close enough that the light reflected from them to Earth is not a single point, but a small disk, and those random vibrations cancel each other out, leaving a steady, cold, stable point of light, like 4 eyes, looking back at you from a distance that the human imagination was not truly designed to understand. Mercury, about 170 million kilometers from you. Mars, a little further, nearly 300 million kilometers, deep red and silent. Saturn, at a distance of more than 1.5 billion kilometers. The light you are seeing left the surface of its giant clouds 85 minutes before reaching your eyes. And Neptune, at the very edge of the solar system, nearly 4.7 billion kilometers away. That light traveled for 4.5 hours to get here. 4 points of light, 4 unbelievable distances. Standing together on a straight line in the sky tonight, as if the universe has arranged them to say something. And if you are patient, if you are not in a hurry, if you let your eyes truly adjust to the darkness instead of trying to see immediately, you will see them fall, streaks of light, fast as a breath interrupted in the middle. Each streak flares up and then vanishes in less than a second, as if someone is crossing out the lines that the universe has just written. That is the Lyrids meteor shower, reaching its peak tonight. One of the oldest meteor showers that humans have ever recorded. The Chinese people saw them in the year 687 before Christ and wrote 3 words in the Chronicles. 2,713 years have passed. The fragments of the same cosmic rock are still falling, the same sky, the same direction. Different people are looking up, feeling that thing which has no name. Tonight, you are one of them. But tonight is different from 2,713 years ago. Tonight, besides the meteor shower and the 4 aligned planets, there is a question hanging in the air. A question that neither mainstream science nor the mystical world has definitively answered. A question about the invisible thing surrounding this planet, which is protecting you right now, and may, just may, be reacting to what is happening in the sky tonight in ways that we are only beginning to understand. That question is about the magnetic field of the Earth, and the journey to the answer, whatever the answer may be, begins from the 4 non-twinkling points of light standing still in the western sky, waiting for you to look up. Before we talk about the mystery, let me tell you about what is actually happening, not what people are speculating, not what not what social media is sharing with sensational headlines, but what is truly going on in the sky, measured by telescopes, calculated by equations, confirmed by people who have spent their entire lives understanding the movement of the stars. From April 16th to the 23rd, 2026, during those 8 days, if you look to the west, as soon as the night is dark enough for the points of light to appear, you will see 4 planets of the solar system appearing almost on the same straight line. Not a different pattern every night, but continuous, steady, for 8 nights in a row, as if the sky is holding a pose and waiting for you to notice. Let me introduce each of them. Mercury, the first one from the horizon, is the smallest and closest planet to the Sun in our solar system. For that reason, it always appears near the horizon, only visible for a short time right after sunset or right before dawn, before the daylight erases it. The ancient Romans named it after the messenger god Mercury, the fastest god in the Olympic temple, because it moves the fastest in the sky, completing 1 orbit around the Sun in only 88 Earth days. In East Asian culture, it is the water star, the star of water, of flexibility, of elusive flows. Its light carries a slightly bluish white color, pale and trembling in the thick air near the ground, like a candle standing in the wind. Mars appears above, much clearer and easier to recognize. Its orange-red color cannot be mistaken for any other celestial body in the night sky. That color comes from the layer of iron oxide, dust, rust, covering the entire surface of the planet, turning it into a red planet without the need for any optical filters. The Romans called it the god of war Mars, not because they knew anything about its chemical composition, but because of the color of blood. In Chinese culture, it is the glimmering delusion, a name that sounds like a warning, like an omen. People said that when the glimmering delusion stops in the sky, the imperial court will face a great change. Ancient Chinese historians recorded many times of Mars staying in the heart of heaven as a national omen. Tonight, Mars is not standing still. It is moving slowly, night by night, on its orbital path. But from our perspective on Earth, it is standing next to its occasional companions. Saturn, the 3rd planet in the line tonight, radiates a pale yellow color, calm. If you have a small telescope, or even a strong enough pair of binoculars, you can see its rings, not as clear as in NASA photos, but enough to see that it is different, that it is not a simple sphere, but a planet wearing jewelry. Those rings are made of billions of pieces of ice and rock, from the size of a grain of sand to the size of a house, rotating around Saturn in a dance perfectly controlled by gravity. Saturn is the lightest planet in the solar system. Its density is so low that if you had a large enough bathtub, it would float on water. But do not let that lightness fool you. It is 95 times heavier than Earth. The Romans named it after the god Saturn, the god of agriculture, of time, of order. In astrology, it is the planet of discipline, of boundaries, of lessons that must be learned through suffering, before they are understood. And finally, Neptune, the most distant one, the dimmest, almost impossible to see with the naked eye if you do not know exactly where to look. At a distance of nearly 4.7 billion kilometers, the light it reflects from the sun takes nearly 4.5 hours to reach the Earth. When the German astronomer Johann Galle first saw it on the night of September 23rd, 1846, based on the calculations of the mathematician Le Verrier, he knew he was looking at something that no one in human history had ever seen before. A planet discovered by mathematics before being seen by the eye, something known from its consequences before it was observed. Those are the 4 planets of the night of April 22nd. 4 completely different worlds, 4 completely different stories, accidentally standing near each other in the sky, like 4 strangers waiting for the same train. But what does aligned mean? This needs to be clarified, not to break the magic, but so that you understand the right kind of magic you are seeing. When astronomers talk about planetary alignment, they do not mean that the planets are lining up in an absolute straight line in 3-dimensional space. Not like beads on a tight string. Each planet is rotating on a slightly different orbital plane, tilted at different angles and at their distances from each other. The concept of the same straight line has almost no physical meaning. What happens is a phenomenon of perspective. From our point of view, on Earth, these planets happen to appear near each other in the sky, like houses at different distances that seem to be in a row when viewed from a specific observation point. Astronomers call this phenomenon a conjunction or an appulse when talking about many celestial bodies at the same time. It is real. It happens. It can be predicted by mathematics tens, hundreds of years in advance with absolute precision, but it does not mean the 4 planets are standing in a row in space like soldiers on parade. And here, you might think, is where the story ends. Just perspective, just an optical illusion. Nothing to see here. But slow down a little, because perspective does not mean not real, and astronomical distances make it very easy for us to underestimate important things. Neptune, though small as a grain of dust from here, has a mass 17 times that of Earth. Saturn is 95 times heavier than us. And gravity, the most fundamental law of the universe, the thing that keeps the moon in its right position, keeps the Earth in orbit, keeps all of us from being thrown into space, never truly turns off. It weakens according to the square of the distance, but it never reaches 0. Right now, as you are lying here, the gravity of Neptune, the furthest planet, is pulling your body lightly toward it. That force is so small it is meaningless, smaller than the pull of a flower placed 1 meter away from you. But it is real. And when these 4 giant celestial bodies align on the same side of the sky, even if not perfectly, even if just by perspective, their combined gravitational pull acts on Earth from the same direction. Instead of 4 weak forces pulling in 4 different directions and partly cancelling each other out, now there is a net force, small but consistent, pulling to one side. Think of the tides. You know that the moon causes tides. It pulls the ocean water toward itself as it orbits the Earth. And you also know that when the moon, the Earth, and the sun align during full moon or new moon days, the tides are higher than usual. People call that a spring tide. The seawater leaps higher, recedes lower, as if the ocean is breathing deeper during those days. That effect comes from two celestial bodies. On the night of April 22nd, there will be four. The gravity of Saturn or Neptune cannot compare to the Moon. They are too far away, not enough to make the seawater fluctuate. But the real question of tonight is not about the seawater. The question is about something much more subtle. Something where even the smallest fluctuations can create consequences larger than we imagined. The question is about the dynamo rotating inside the Earth. The question is about the invisible shield protecting you. But before we get there, let me tell you about the streaks of light falling in the sky tonight, because they are not decorations, they are memories, and their memories are old enough to make our entire human history seem very, very young. There are things in the universe that have existed longer than any memory of humanity, longer than language, longer than fire, longer than that first moment when a creature on this planet looked up and realized that the night sky was not a ceiling, but a window looking out into infinity. Comet Thatcher existed before all of those things. It does not have a heroic shape. It does not have the magnificent beauty of the celestial bodies you often see in astronomical photos. If you could stand close enough to see it with the naked eye, which no one can do, and no one will be able to do for at least 250 years, you would see a dark, rough, irregular mass of matter with a diameter estimated at a few kilometers, made of ice, rock, cosmic dust, and complex organic molecules that even modern science has not fully classified yet. It is not beautiful. It looks like a piece of frozen black earth stuck in space. But it has been here, wandering in this darkness, since the solar system was not yet stable, since the planets you are looking at tonight were still in the process of forming from clouds of dust and gas swirling around the early sun. It is a relic, a fragment left over from the time when all that existed in our solar system was just chaos and possibility. The orbit of Comet Thatcher is not a neat circle like the orbits of the planets. It is a giant ellipse, flat and long, a curve starting from the cold outskirts of the solar system, where the temperature is only a few degrees above absolute zero, rushing inward close enough to the sun for the ice to begin to evaporate, then flaring out and disappearing into the darkness for centuries. One complete orbit takes about 415 years. Let that number sink in. In the time that Comet Thatcher completes one orbit, humanity has experienced the 30 Years' War, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, 2 world wars, the nuclear age, the space age, and the internet age. That entire progress within one orbit of a frozen rock wandering in the darkness. The last time Comet Thatcher came closest to the Sun was 1861. In that year, the Earth was witnessing the American Civil War. Pasteur was proving the germ theory. The electric light had not been invented. The next time it returns will be around the year 2276. When the people listening to this voice, and their children, and their grandchildren, and perhaps the great-grandchildren of their great-grandchildren, will all longer be in this world. None of us will see Comet Thatcher with the naked eye. But once a year, in late April, when the Earth passes through the dust trail it left behind in its journey across centuries, we see its traces. Those fragments, tiny dust and stone particles no larger than a grain of sand, some only 1,000th of a millimeter, have floated in space for hundreds of years since separating from the mother comet. They are scattered along the orbital path of Thatcher, forming a cosmic dust trail stretching millions of kilometers. And every year, the Earth, rushing around the Sun at 30 kilometers per second, cuts across that dust trail. Those tiny fragments rush into our atmosphere at about 49 kilometers per second. Faster than 1,400 times the speed of a rifle bullet, and in a few seconds of contact with the thick air, they burn up completely, transforming their kinetic energy entirely into light and heat, and leaving behind them streaks of glowing plasma that exist for less than a second before disappearing. That is what you see falling tonight. Not stars, not meteorites, just the tiny dust particles of an ancient comet drawing their final lines in the sky, shining brightly only once before disappearing completely, leaving no trace. People call this shower the Lyrids, taking the name from the constellation Lyra, the Lyrae in the northeast sky, where the meteor streaks seem to radiate from when viewed with the eye. That is an illusion of perspective. Once again, the universe plays with the way we look, but the ancient people did not know that. They only saw small fires falling from the direction of the ancient harp in the sky, and they told the story. Lyra, in Greek mythology, is the harp of Orpheus, the greatest musician in the world of gods and mortals. Orpheus played the harp so well that stones softened, rivers changed course, the most ferocious beasts stopped to listen. When his wife, Eurydice, died of a snake bite on their wedding day, Orpheus went down to the underworld to claim her back. He played the harp before the throne of Hades and Persephone. And for the first time in the history of hell, the gods of death cried. They gave Eurydice back to him with only one condition. He must lead her out of hell without turning his head to look back once. Until both stepped onto the world of the living, he did not make it. At the last step, only one last step before they left the darkness, he turned his head back, perhaps because of worry, perhaps because he could not believe she was truly there, perhaps because the love was too great to be contained in silence and faith. Eurydice disappeared. Immediately, irretrievably, Orpheus wandered the world with a silent harp, not playing, not singing, until he was torn apart by the Bacchae women, the furious followers of the god Dionysus, in a night of lunar madness. His lyre was thrown into the Hebrus River, floating out to sea, still humming the final notes, even though no hand touched it. And Zeus, feeling pity, placed that harp in the sky as the constellation Lyra. The ancient Greeks believed that the Lyrids meteor shower was exactly those harp strings, breaking off one by one over the years, falling from the sky, emitting the final light before fading away. Each meteor is a note that has never been played, a whisper of Orpheus for Eurydice that no one is strong enough to hear anymore. You may not believe in myths. That is perfectly fine, but try lying here in the darkness and let your mind touch this. The people who told that story of Orpheus sat under this same sky, looked at these same streaks of light, and felt in their hearts that something sad and beautiful and larger than language was happening above their heads. And they were right, not about the harp string, but about the feeling that the universe is saying something that only those who are quiet enough can hear. In China, the oldest record of the Lyrids dates back to the year 687 before Christ in the chronicles of the Zhou dynasty. Only a few words, the stars fell like rain, no explanation, no theory, only a person sitting and writing in the night looking up and recording what they saw with the heartbreaking honesty of a person who knows that no words are enough, but still must write. In Japan, the falling streaks of light are the souls of the deceased visiting. Each meteor is a brief meeting, just enough for you to know that they still remember you before they return to the place where language does not reach. In many Southeast Asian cultures, meteor showers are a sign of transition, not a disaster, not a bad omen, but a threshold. Something is ending, something is beginning. And the moment between the high states, the moment of the meteor, is the most sacred moment when both worlds are existing simultaneously on the same stretch of sky. On the night of April 22nd, 2026, the Lyrids are reaching their peak. From a completely dark location, without light pollution, you can see from 15 to 20 meteors per hour, sometimes more in random bursts, when the Earth passes through a thicker cloud of dust in the orbital trail of Comet Thatcher and in the western sky. 4 planets are quietly looking down. There is a moment, around after midnight, when the constellation Lyra rises to its highest point in the sky and the light streaks fall the most. That if you are lucky, if the sky has no clouds, if you have lain still long enough for your eyes to adjust to true darkness, you can see both at the same time. The northeast, the streaks of light flashing and fading like Morse signals from a language not yet decoded. The west, 4 steady points of light, not vibrating, looking down with the calm of things that have existed longer than every concept of human worry. And you lie in the middle on the back of a planet rushing at 30 kilometers per second through space, wrapped in an invisible magnetic field that right now is doing its job without your attention, breathing in, breathing out, looking up. That is a moment enough to make any question become smaller, even the largest questions. But the largest question of tonight refuses to become smaller. It is still waiting, patient, behind the light streaks and the planetary points. The question about the invisible shield, the question about the dynamo rotating in the heart of the Earth, right below you, rotating right now, without stopping, has not stopped in 4.5 billion years. And what happens to it when 4 planets pull to one side? Let me tell you about that shield. There is something protecting you right now. Not a wall, not a roof, not any material that human hands have manufactured. The thing protecting you has no fixed shape. It has no color. It does not emit sound. You cannot touch it, cannot see it, cannot smell it. And throughout your normal life, you will never feel its presence. Not because it is not there, but because it never lets you have to feel its absence. It works in silence, continuously, without stopping. For 4.5 billion years, that is the magnetic field of the Earth, or more precisely, the magnetosphere. To understand it, let us start from the center of this planet. Imagine you are standing on the surface of the Earth. Below your feet is the thin layer of soil that plants take root in. Below that is the layer of rock, the crust 5 to 70 kilometers thick, depending on the place. Below the rock layer is the mantle, nearly 2,900 kilometers thick, hot enough for the rock to be half solid, half flowing, moving in slow convection. Currents so slow that millions of years are only enough to shift a continent a few hundred kilometers, and below all those things, at the true center of this planet, is the core. The inner core, a solid ball of iron and nickel, solid due to terrible pressure, about 1,220 kilometers in diameter. the outer core surrounding it. Liquid iron and nickel, hot to about 4,000 to 5,000 degrees Celsius, nearly equal to the surface temperature of the Sun, and constantly moving in complex convection currents driven by temperature, by chemical composition, and by the Coriolis force, generated from the rotation of the Earth. Liquid metal is moving. Moving liquid metal is a moving electrical conductor. A moving electrical conductor creates a magnetic field. This is the most fundamental law of electromagnetism, discovered by Faraday and Ampere in the 19th century, but the Earth itself has applied it since it was a fireball just cooled enough to have a liquid metal core. The liquid iron core of the Earth is a geodynamo, a planetary generator, self-powering and self-maintaining its own magnetic field, according to a mechanism that geophysicists have understood in basic principle but still have not fully simulated in computers. That magnetic field spreads out into space, not as a hard shell, but as a zone of influence, spreading, weakening, but never reaching zero. On the side facing the Sun, it is compressed at a distance of about 65,000 kilometers from the surface of the Earth. That is, the bow shock point, where it meets the solar wind and resists. On the side, hidden from the Sun, it is pulled out like a giant tail, millions of kilometers, following the Earth in its journey around the Sun, like the shadow of something that has no shape. And its job, its unique, irreplaceable purpose, is to stand between you and the thing that could kill all life on this planet without a second of warning. The solar wind, the Sun, every second, ejects about 1 million tons of matter, mainly protons and electrons moving at speeds from 400 to 800 kilometers per second. This flow of charged particles never stops. It has no morning or evening. It does not rest. Every second of every day, for 4.5 billion years, the Sun has continuously fired this plasma flow in every direction, like something that is burning and cannot be held back. And besides that regular solar wind, there are more violent events, the coronal mass ejections, the CME. This is when the Sun suddenly ejects billions of tons of thick plasma with an extremely strong magnetic field at a speed that can be double or triple the normal solar wind. A large CME can carry enough energy to evaporate all the water on the surface of the Earth if it comes close enough and nothing blocks it. The magnetosphere is the thing that blocks it. Every day, the magnetosphere of the Earth endures millions of tons of matter from the Sun rushing in and deflects them away. Most of those particles are pushed to the sides, running along the border of the magnetosphere and drifting away in space. Some are trapped in the Van Allen radiation belts, the high radiation zones surrounding the Earth at an altitude of thousands of kilometers. Only a small part enters the atmosphere at the two poles, where the magnetic field guides them down, and when they collide with the gas molecules in the high layers of the sky, they create light. The aurora, the thing that people in the polar regions have looked at and worshipped and feared and loved for thousands of years. The curtain of green and purple and red light dancing in the night sky is exactly the visual sign of the magnetosphere doing its job. It is the spark of the invisible war between the Earth and the Sun, happening every day, without stopping. No one wins and no one loses, only a continuous and shimmering balance. Without the magnetosphere, Earth would be Mars. The red planet was not always red as it is now. Geological evidence shows that Mars once had liquid water on the surface, had a thicker atmosphere, might have had conditions supporting forms of life that we do not know yet. But about 4 billion years ago, for reasons that the scientific world is still debating, the magnetic field of Mars weakened and went out. There was nothing left to block the solar wind, and in the next billions of years, the solar wind slowly, patiently, continuously eroded the atmosphere of the red planet, blowing every gas molecule into space until almost nothing was left. Today, the atmospheric pressure on Mars is only 0.6% of that on Earth. Water only exists as ice in the ground. Ultraviolet radiation and cosmic rays fire directly at the surface without anything to filter them. No life we have ever known could survive on that for even 1 hour. That is the future of a planet without a magnetic field. And this is what makes tonight not just a beautiful astronomical event. The magnetic field of the Earth is changing, not in the distant future. Right now, in real time, so slow that none of us feel it, but so fast that the measurement tools cannot ignore it. The magnetic North Pole, the point that your compass needle always points to, does not stand still. It moves. It has moved since we began to measure it. But in the recent few decades, that movement speed has increased sharply from about 15 kilometers per year in the early 20th century to nearly 55 kilometers per year currently. It is rushing towards Siberia at a speed no one predicted before. The overall intensity of the magnetic field of the Earth has decreased by about 9% in the last 170 years since we began to measure systematically in the 19th century. And there is a zone, a patch of anomaly stretching from South America to South Africa, where the magnetic field is unusually weak, like a small crack on the shield. Scientists call it the South Atlantic anomaly. Satellites flying through this zone often experience unexplained electronic interference. Astronauts on the International Space Station often report seeing strange flashes of light in their vision when flying through here, not from an external light source, but from within. High-energy radiation particles are piercing directly through the weaker protection layer and interacting directly with their optic nerves. The shield is not perfect. It is not uniform. It is, in a sense, breathing, expanding and contracting, strengthening and weakening, shifting and distorting according to cycles that we are only beginning to understand. And on the night of April 22nd, 4 planets with a total mass more than 200 times the Earth will align on the same side of the sky. Their combined gravitational pull, small but consistent toward one side, will act on that dynamo inside the Earth, which is creating that shield. Does that mean anything? That is the question that science is trying to answer. And the answer, honest, without decoration, is more complex than both yes and no. Let us stop for a moment here. In this story, there are times when we need to look directly at the numbers, not because numbers are more attractive than stories, but because understanding the numbers correctly will help you realize why the real question is more interesting than the simple answer. Gravity follows a rule described for the first time by Isaac Newton in 1687. In the book Principia Mathematica, the book that many people believe is the most influential in the history of science. That rule says the force between two objects is proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. The square is the key. Distance doubles, force decreases 4 times. Distance increases 10 times, force decreases 100 times. Distance increases 1,000 times, force decreases 1,000,000 times. Saturn is at an average distance of more than 1.2 billion kilometers from the Earth. To compare, the Moon is only about 384,000 kilometers from us, meaning Saturn is about 3,100 times further than the Moon. And even though Saturn is about 95,000 times heavier than the Moon, that distance difference, the square of 3,100 is nearly 10 million, means the gravity of Saturn acting on Earth is hundreds of times smaller than the force of the Moon. Neptune is even 3 times further. Its force is almost insignificant in terms of tides. This is the reason astronomers say that the planetary alignment does not have a significant effect on the Earth in terms of pure gravitational force. And they are right about that. Completely accurately right, but the story does not end here. Because the question about the magnetic field is not a question about gravity. It is a question about electromagnetism, a field more complex, more subtle, and still with many things we do not yet understand. Let me lead you to a concept that few people outside the space physics world know. The Sun does not only eject matter, it also carries its own magnetic field into the entire solar system. When the Sun rotates, and it rotates faster at the equator, slower at the poles, it pulls its magnetic field, twisting out into space like the sleeves of a dancer who is spinning. This structure spreads out for billions of kilometers, covering the entire solar system, and space physicists call it the interplanetary magnetic field, the IMF. The IMF is not flat. It ripples, twisting in an Archimedean spiral as the Sun rotates, creating folds and bends stretching hundreds of millions of kilometers. Space physics has a poetic name for this structure: the heliospheric current sheet, a thin, rippling structure, spreading like the spinning skirt of a dancer rotating forever in space. Each planet, as it moves in its orbit, cuts through this structure, and each planet has its own magnetosphere, or at least has induced magnetic structures, interacting with the IMF in complex ways. The question that some researchers in the field of space plasma physics, a real field with peer-reviewed journals, with satellite magnetometers, with experimental data, are asking is, when many planets align on the same side of the Sun, does their combined interaction with the IMF create ripples, local distortions in the interplanetary magnetic field structure? And if so, can those ripples travel along the solar wind toward the Earth, affecting the so-called BZ component, the north-south magnetic field component of the IMF, and from there, affecting how the magnetosphere of the Earth reacts? This is not mystical speculation. This is physics. The agency NASA has an entire system of satellites continuously monitoring the fluctuations in the IMF and BZ, because those fluctuations are real and have real consequences. When BZ suddenly turns negative, meaning the south direction in the magnetic coordinate system, the magnetosphere of the Earth opens in a certain way, allowing energy from the solar wind to pour in, causing what we call a geomagnetic storm. Geomagnetic storms are not a small matter. They interfere with GPS systems. They make airplane pilots lose compass orientation. They can overload power grids in high latitude regions, the event of 1989 in Quebec. Canada, a geomagnetic storm caused a total blackout of the province for 9 hours, leaving 6 million people without electricity in the middle of winter. And in extreme cases, like the Carrington event of 1859, that we will talk about later, they can erase the entire electronic infrastructure of a civilization. Does the alignment of 4 planets on the night of April 22nd create any change in the IMF? Does it increase the possibility of a geomagnetic storm? Current science does not have enough long-term data to confirm or deny this definitively. Studies have been conducted, but the results are not consistent. Some statistical analyses show a weak correlation between certain planetary configurations and unusual geomagnetic activity. But correlation is not cause, and those studies have not been widely re-verified. This is frontier science, the boundary where what we know is touching what we do not know yet. It is not superstition, it is not established science. It is the uncomfortable but honest space lying between those two extremes. There is one more interesting thing to mention. Few people know. In the history of geophysics, there is a phenomenon called lunisolar, forcing the combined influence of the Moon and the Sun on the Earth core. Recent research, based on the analysis of tiny variations in the rotation speed of the Earth, shows that tidal forces from the Moon and the Sun can have a weak but measurable influence on the structure of the flow in the liquid metal outer core. If the Moon, 384,000 kilometers away, can do that, then do the 4 planets at the same time, though much further, create any effect when added together? The honest answer: we do not yet have tools sensitive enough to measure. That does not mean there is nothing. It means we have not seen it yet, and the history of science is full of times when we did not see something until we created the right tools. Black holes were once pure mathematics. Gravitational waves were once only equations of Einstein. Until the LIGO machine was built sensitive enough, we began to hear the universe talking to itself. Perhaps one day we will have measuring machines sensitive enough to answer the question about the 4 planets and the magnetic field definitively. Tonight? Not yet. Tonight we stand at the threshold of the question. And sometimes the threshold is the most interesting place to stand. Now let us step over that threshold, not by giving up reason, but by carrying reason along, but keeping it light enough not to break things more delicate than it. There are 3 hypotheses circulating in those communities located at the boundary between independent physics, research, and spiritual thinking. Those communities that are sometimes dismissed too quickly by mainstream academia and sometimes accepted too easily by the masses without passing through a critical filter. I will present all 3 honestly, without exaggeration, without downplaying, and I will let you hold your own judgment in a very private place within where only you know what you truly believe in. Hypothesis 1. Schumann resonance and collective consciousness. In 1952, the German physicist Winfried Otto Schumann accidentally calculated that the space between the surface of the Earth and the ionosphere, the upper layer of atmosphere, where gas molecules are ionized by solar radiation, acts as an electromagnetic cavity. Like the air in a resonance box vibrating with certain frequencies, that cavity resonates with electromagnetic waves at extremely low frequencies generated by millions of lightning strikes hitting the Earth's surface every day. The fundamental frequency of that resonance is about 7.83 Hertz. This is a real number, measurable by equipment, published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, not mysticism, pure physics. What becomes interesting is 7.8. 3 Hz lies within the frequency spectrum of human brainwaves, specifically theta waves from about 4 to 8 Hz, associated with deep meditation, light sleep, the state right before consciousness sinks into sleep. That moment when you are no longer completely awake, but not yet completely asleep, that moment when thoughts begin to dream and images begin to appear that you have no intention to create, is the moment when your brain is vibrating at a frequency very close to the Vahartind of the Earth. No one knows exactly the meaning of that coincidence, but some researchers, including those from medical and neurological backgrounds, not only from the spiritual community, have raised the question about the connection between fluctuations in the Schumann resonance and the collective psychological state of humans. There are analyses, not yet fully re-verified, it must be clearly stated, showing that periods of unusual Schumann resonance coincide with times of large-scale social instability, and the Schumann resonance fluctuates according to solar activity. Solar activity can be affected, according to mechanisms not yet fully clear, by the relative positions of the planets in the solar system, through tiny tidal effects on the plasma ball of the Sun. This is a very long chain of cause and effect. Each link might be very weak, but in non-linear systems, and the human brain, the Sun, and the magnetosphere of the Earth are all non-linear systems. Small effects at the start of the chain sometimes create disproportionate consequences at the end of the chain. That is what chaos theory has taught us. Complex systems do not operate according to simple addition. A butterfly wing flap can, in the right conditions, contribute to a storm on the other side of the globe. The night of April 22nd is not a butterfly. Those are 4 planets, with a total mass greater than everything you can imagine. Hypothesis 2, tidal force acting on the liquid metal core. We have talked about tides. The moon pulls water, simple, measurable, undeniable. But the question is, why only water? The liquid metal in the outer core of the Earth, iron and nickel flowing at a temperature of 4,000 to 5,000 degrees Celsius, is also a liquid. Tidal forces act on liquid, whether it is water or molten metal. Normally, the gravity of the planets acts from many different directions and tends to cancel each other out. Jupiter pulls this way, Saturn pulls that way, Neptune pulls in another direction. The net result is almost zero. But when 4 planets align on the same side, as on the night of April 22nd, the net result is no longer zero. It is small, very small, but it is consistent and directional. Can that small but consistent net force, acting for many consecutive days, from April 16th to the 23rd, create any fluctuation in the flow structure of the liquid metal core? And if so, even if very small, can the core of the Earth, which is already not completely stable and is undergoing its own mysterious changes, react in a not completely linear way? The honest answer is, we do not know. Current geophysical models say insignificant, but those models also do not fully explain why the magnetic North Pole is accelerating in a way that no model predicted before the year 2000. There is something changing in the core of the Earth that we do not understand. And in the gap of that misunderstanding, the question about the 4 planets is not crazy. Hypothesis 3, And this is the hypothesis furthest from the language of the lab, but also the hypothesis closest to what humans have felt from 10,000 years ago to today. Many ancient sacred traditions do not consider astronomical events as physical causes of change. They consider them as language, symbols that the universe places in time to mark important moments, as people place milestones on a road. In the ancient Vedic astrology of India, Jyotish, a system with a history of thousands of years and studied seriously by scholars, the convergence of many planets in the same region of the sky is called Graha Yuddha, planet war. Not war in the literal sense, but a condensed moment when different cosmic energies collide and force each other, when hidden trends are amplified, when what can still happen in many directions is suddenly pushed toward one direction. The Mayan people, with astronomical science, advanced to an amazing degree. They calculated the planet positions with a precision that modern telescopes could only improve by a small part. They integrated astronomical events into their sacred calendars, not as omens of disaster, but as gates, moments when reality is easier to bend than normal, when intention and action have more power than ordinary days. There is something deep in that way of looking, not because it is confirmed by science. It has not been and might never be, because it talks about things that equations do not measure, but because it reflects an ancient intuition that so many independent cultures have arrived at, that the sky and humans are not two completely separate systems, that we do not stand outside the universe to observe it. We are a part of it, made from the same atoms, subject to the same physical forces, operating in the same time. And when the universe arranges itself in a special way, when 4 planets align and the ancient meteor shower falls in the same night, perhaps what happens is not the universe acting on us. Perhaps what happens is that we, being a part of the universe, are vibrating along with some configuration of the whole, like a harp string beginning to vibrate, when hearing a note of the right frequency, not being forced, but recognizing. You do not have to believe in this, but I invite you, tonight, while you lie still in the darkness, try to pay attention. Not trying to feel something miraculous, not believing in any theory, simply pay attention. See if you find anything different in the breath, in the quiet, after every thought settles, in the threshold moment between wake and sleep that people call hypnagogia. The universe has existed for 13.8 billion years. It does not need you to believe in it to do what it does, but sometimes your attention is enough. In human history, there are nights when the sky and fate seem to stand very close to each other. I do not say this as a supernatural statement. I have no proof that the sky decides history, but I have very clear proof that history is shaped by how humans react to the sky, by what they see when they look up, by the stories they tell about what they see, and by the actions that those stories drive. And that, in a sense, is the most real kind of power of the sky. Let us start from around the year 2 before Christ. Around that time, according to astronomical analysis performed by modern researchers using orbit simulation software, a special event happened in the eastern sky. Jupiter and Venus, the 2 brightest celestial bodies in the night sky after the moon, approached each other so much that, observing with the naked eye, they appeared to merge into a single point of light, unusually brilliant, hovering just above the western horizon after the sun set. For the observers in the ancient Middle East and Mediterranean, the Babylonian astrologers, The Chaldean priests, those who had followed the sky, not with telescopes but with patience and collective memory, passed through many generations. An unusual point of light appearing in the eastern night sky was not a physical event. It was a message. Many scholars and historical astronomers suggest that this could be the true origin of the Star of Bethlehem image. Not a miracle, not a supernatural phenomenon, but a real astronomical event interpreted by the wise observers of that time through the lens of their language and beliefs. Then passed down, recorded, and became an image that has shaped 2,000 years of human history. A point of light in the sky, and humanity is still talking about it, after more than 20 centuries. Year 1504, the coast of Jamaica. Christopher Columbus, in his fourth expedition, is stuck. 2 ships were rotted, food is gone, and the native Arawak people, those who had saved the life of the expedition with food and fresh water for many months, are losing patience with the guests who were not invited and show no signs of leaving. Columbus has one thing the Arawaks do not have: the astronomical almanac of Regiomontanus, a table of celestial positions dense with numbers, prepared by one of the most excellent mathematicians of the 15th century. And in that table, Columbus sees a line: February 29th, 1504, there will be a total lunar eclipse. He summoned the Arawak leaders and told them that his god was angry, that tonight, exactly tonight, the god would withdraw the moon as evidence of the wrath. Right on time, the moon began to turn copper, then dark red, and disappeared gradually into the shadow of the earth. The Arawaks panicked. They brought food, they begged, they pleaded with Columbus to ask the god for forgiveness. Columbus went inside the ship, pretending to pray, actually monitoring the hourglass, and stepped out exactly when the moon began to brighten again, declaring that his God had forgiven them. That was nothing supernatural. No magnetic field was bent, just a person with knowledge that others do not have, standing under the same sky, looking at the same phenomenon, the non-UFO phenomenon, and understanding it in a different way. Knowledge of the sky is power, not a metaphor. It is real power. September 1859, the Carrington event. This is the most important story in this part, and it is not a fairy tale. Early in the morning of September 1st, 1859, the British amateur astronomer Richard Carrington was observing the sun through a telescope when he witnessed something that no one in recorded history had ever seen before: a flare of white light directly from the sun's surface, not from the faint outer corona, but from the solar disk itself. Lasting about 5 minutes, then going out, he ran to find witnesses to confirm what he saw. When he returned, it had disappeared. He recorded it, sent reports, and continued to observe. 17 hours later, hell began, or rather, the aurora began, but not a normal aurora in the polar regions. Aurora in Cuba, in Colombia, in Hawaii. The miners in the Rocky Mountains woke up at 1 o'clock in the morning because the northern sky was red like sunset, and they thought morning had come, began to cook breakfast. In Hawaii, people could read newspapers under the light of the aurora at midnight. The telegraph system, the most advanced communication technology of the 19th century, equivalent to the internet today, collapsed completely. Not because wires broke, because the induced current from the geomagnetic storm was running through every metal wire on the planet. Some telegraph stations caught fire. Some operators reported that they could still send and receive messages after completely disconnecting from the power source, electricity from the sky was running through their wires without needing a supply. When the economic numbers of the Carrington event are estimated according to modern standards. With the electronic infrastructure of the world today, the damage ranges from 1 to 2 trillion US dollars. The global power grid collapses. GPS systems stop working. Communication satellites are destroyed. The internet is paralyzed. Food cold storage loses power. Medical and urban water systems stop working. And that was only one geomagnetic storm. No planetary alignment. No ritual. No omen. Only the sun, in a moment of instability in its plasma ball, ejected an unbelievable amount of energy in exactly our direction. And the magnetosphere of the Earth, in that night, fought alone, not strong enough to block completely, but enough to ensure that radiation did not kill all life on the planet's surface within a few hours. That was the magnetosphere working in an overwhelmed state, cracked, distorted, aurora exploding at low latitudes like glowing wounds in the sky. But it stood firm. The Carrington event reminds us of this by the language of real history. The magnetosphere matters. Its fluctuations matter. And any factor, even small, that can affect its state in the moments the sun is not stable, is also worth serious study. Not because the 4 planets on the night of April 22nd are about to cause a new Carrington event. There is no evidence for that, but because it reminds us that the invisible shield is not eternal, it is not invulnerable. It is working, and we are living inside it. And tonight is a good night to remember that, not with worry, with gratitude. We have traveled a very long journey tonight. And now is the time for you to rest. But before you completely let yourself sink into sleep, let me remind you one last time of what we have touched upon. Not to summarize, but so that those images follow you into your dreams like gentle companions. 4 planets are standing in the sky tonight, not twinkling, steady. 4 points of light from 4 unbelievable distances, each carrying a mass exceeding every measurement concept of daily life, are quietly looking down at this tiny planet where tiny creatures are asking questions about them. The meteor streaks are falling from the direction of the Orpheus harp, the fragments of an ancient comet burning for the last time after hundreds of millions of cold kilometers in space, before disappearing completely and quietly, like all the most beautiful, brightest things, Fikes, always disappearing before we can say everything we want to say. Below you, at a depth of thousands of kilometers, a mass of burning liquid metal is swirling and flowing and rotating, creating an invisible magnetic field, spreading hundreds of thousands of kilometers into space, which at this moment is blocking the storms of charged particles from the sun, so that you can lie here in the darkness, breathing gently without being destroyed by the sky. And the question about what happens when the 4 planets align, whether the magnetic field is bent, whether something more subtle is happening, that our tools are not yet sensitive enough to measure, that question does not need to be answered tonight. It can stay there, hovering, gently, like a small lamp at the end of a long corridor that you will have an entire life to walk toward. Not every question needs an answer to become valuable. Sometimes the question is the most precious part, the moment when you realize that the world is larger than what you know. And that feeling, instead of making you worried, actually makes you feel more relieved. Because if the world is larger than what you know, then It means your worries are also smaller compared to the whole than you think. There is one thing that the observers of the sky across thousands of years, from the Joe historian writing 3 words, "Stars fall like rain," in the year 687 before Christ, to the Mayan astronomers, night after night, staring up from the limestone pyramid peaks, to the modern physicists monitoring computer screens, displaying satellite data, tracking the interplanetary magnetic field. All of them have in common, without exception, humility. Not the humility of the defeated, but the humility of the person standing before something larger than them and choosing to feel privileged instead of afraid. Tonight, the sky is doing what it has done since before humans appeared and will continue to do after all that we build returns to dust. 4 planets are standing in line. Meteor showers are falling. The magnetosphere is breathing according to its own rhythm, slow as geological time, patient as the foundation of all life. And you are lying here in the darkness, held on the ground by gravity, protected from the sky by the magnetic field, kept warm by the atmosphere, breathing oxygen that the green plants on this planet have created over millions of years. You do not need to do anything more tonight. You only need to let yourself be here. Close your eyes if you have not closed them. Relax your shoulders. Relax your jaw. Let the breath slow down. No need to intentionally make it slow. Just stop trying to make it fast. The sky is still there above you, whether you look or not. The 4 planets are still standing in line. The meteor shower is still falling. Each streak, each streak, each streak. The last fragments of Comet Thatcher are flaring up in a split second, then disappearing into silence, like everything, like every moment, like tonight. Good night.